The bodies of soldiers killed in the Civil War were once buried here in the Rio Grande Valley. But after President Abraham Lincoln called the soldiers to be buried with dignity, the bodies were later relocated. Eugene Fernandez has the details in tonight's Throwback Thursday.
This was a cemetery. I'm standing on grounds that actually contained about 3,700 soldiers' remains. What this is, or was, at the time just after the Civil War, was the National Cemetery. The National Cemetery system was created by Abraham Lincoln in 1862 as the war was going on. Now, it was decreed by Congress in that year, but mainly it was for the disposition of Union soldiers in the North. Stepping up into time, actually, the Confederate soldiers were not ratified legally to be buried in the national cemetery systems of the country until 1906, if you can believe that. That was during the administration of President Theodore Roosevelt, and he gave a full pardon to all Confederate soldiers so that we may live in peace forever after. When the national cemetery system was set up in 1862, there were originally 14 burial sites in the country. At present, we have 147 of them. One is in Puerto Rico and one is in Mexico City because of the Mexican War that we had there. These were hallowed grounds that were set up by our country in order to give decent burial to the military that served in the protection of our lands. In Brownsville, in the Fort Brown area, this was not the first cemetery. There were several of them that actually preceded this one. When the skirmish began in 1846 and Zachary Taylor's forces were at the bulwarks, were at the breastworks there at Fort Brown, right across from the river, not too far from here. The battle took place, and after that battle, there were 2 casualties immediately. That was Colonel Cross, who was on reconnaissance, and then a Sergeant Weigert, who was actually killed in the bombardment. And then you had Major Jacob Brown, who was killed in that particular bombardment. The first burials that took place were right there within the outer walls of the earthworks of Fort Brown, but that was right on the river. And then Major Brown was buried inside the encampment there. Once that the skirmish was over and we get up to 1848, those burials were removed to a little further behind me here, and that was what's called the parade grounds of the new establishment of Fort Brown. Understanding that this was the burial place for active military and sometimes their spouses during the period of warfares throughout this region, the entire border zone had begun a program going back to 1905 to demilitarize several forts on the border, and Brownsville was one of them. It was the Brownsville affair that just kind of like put the nail in the coffin on that. Getting off into 1909, the program of centralizing the national cemeteries throughout the country was in motion. A contract was let to a Mr. Rendell. It took them 3 months to dig up all of the remains that were in here. And it took 5 boxcars of the railway to get them from here to what's called Pineville, Louisiana. Pineville, Louisiana had an establishment outside of its bounds called the Alexandria National Cemetery. That's where these remains ended up. Who is in this cemetery? You go back into the very, very beginnings when Brownsville went through the Mexican War. Well, of course, those burials were transferred here after the ratification of this site. And then you also had transfers from Fort Polk, which was in Point Isabel, that were the original burials that took place for the Battle of Palo Alto. Those were transferred here as well. Then you also had other border burials in Laredo, Fort McIntosh, Fort Clark, and all that were put in here. All of that whole conglomerate was taken up to Pineville in order to establish what we would call the Brownsville sector of the National Cemetery there. What Lincoln said in his initial description of the plan for the national cemeteries was to give them dignity. They had given their lives for their country in one form or another. They were laid to rest in a peaceful location and perpetually given an area whereby their spirits could rest in peace. Brownsville played very, very heavily in this. It put its mark in the military annals all throughout 100 years of its existence. And the rest is history. For KVEO News, I'm Eugene Fernandez.